good session with Loggerhead Shrikes. I am very eager to participate. I work for the state. I'm the agency lead for non-game birds, state ornithologist, and basically my role in the state is, from an agency perspective, is to oversee conservation, management, research, and outreach for the state's bird species. Unfortunately, there's only one of me in the state, and most other states have someone that leads on birds. Others have, some states have a lot more, but I'm pretty much running nonstop every day. So what I want to talk about is a little bit of what we do as a state agency, and from there lead into an example of how bird banding can fit within state and federal and basically conservation management at all levels. But in this case, I'm going to use a case study of the Loggerhead Shrike, a bird that really doesn't fit very well into many categories and is really, really not doing well. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that we're doing with shrikes. Basically, I'm going to go through what we're doing as a working group with shrikes. I'm going to walk through the trapping and banding process. I've got a lot of pictures to show. And I'm going to finish up with the types of results that we're getting and where we want to take it in the future. So again, in my agency, there's not just bird person like me. We've got mussel biologists, we've got botanists, we've got data managers. All of us oversee our various taxa and help support the agency's efforts as it pertains to the state's wildlife. The thing that really guides our work, and this is the case for every state since 2005, are state wildlife action plans. Basically, it's mandated by the federal government that each state has one of these plans, and if we do not complete a plan, we don't get a big chunk of federal money that basically pays all of our salaries, or at least much of our salaries. So there's a real incentive on multiple levels to get these done. They're also remarkably helpful in guiding work not only at the state level, but at the regional and national level as well. When we talk about these plans, we're always talking with each other, particularly during the writing process, but during the 10-year period that each plan is active, we're constantly retooling it and working on it. So as part of this plan, every taxa submits a list of species that they consider of greatest conservation need. We call them SGCNs. The bird list is in front of you. It goes on to butterflies and herps and plants and mammals and everything else that you can think of. The West Virginia bird list has a little bit over 70 species. These are the species that, for whatever reason, are of particular concern to us. And the concern can come from any number of different angles. It can be because the species occurs very spotty in the state. Maybe there's one place in the state where it occurs. For West Virginia, an example might be upland sandpiper. We have one known breeding site for upland sandpiper in the state right now. It might be because the trend for that species is very poor and scary, in fact, and that's the case for wood thrush, for example. Wood thrush is still incredibly common on the landscape, but nonetheless it's nowhere near as common as it once was. So we take a look at wood thrush and we say, what can we do? What should we do? What is our responsibility for wood thrush? And lo and behold, recent bird atlas analysis that we've done with our abundance sampling indicates that no other state in the country has more wood thrushes than West Virginia. We have over 10% of the global breeding population for the species. So when you start to look at it that way, that's incredibly compelling from a conservation standpoint. Another species that Dave mentioned earlier is cerulean warbler. West Virginia has over 35% of the global breeding population for the species. So it's a critically important thing. So it runs a whole gamut, and Loggerhead Shrike fits more in the first category. It's a species that once was much more abundant and is now in pretty big danger, particularly in the east and northeastern states. if we were to take these species and group them into categories, there are three main categories or guilds or groups of species that come out that we really have cause for concern about. In order, grassland species, they're generally declining as the way that our grasslands are managed changes, and the trend generally is not very good. In some cases, it's very interesting. If you take grasshopper sparrow, for example, as there's an increasing amount of reclaimed surface mine in southwestern coal fields, those reclaimed minelands are crawling with grasshopper sparrows. But if you go other places, they're declining in the state. If you take a look at vesper sparrow, for example, vesper sparrow is in pretty big trouble in West Virginia. Shrike, meadowlark, these other species. Another group is species of early successional habitats. Of probably biggest importance to us right now is golden-winged warbler. The species is in free fall, and unfortunately we're not too terribly optimistic about our chances of preserving it on the landscape. But there are others as well that we do stand a good chance of saving if we are able to manage appropriately on the landscape. A good example of that would be ruffed grouse. Finally, and probably most importantly in West Virginia, are birds of forested landscapes. West Virginia is still about 80% forested, and as I mentioned with wood thrush, hosts very high abundances of a lot of forest songbirds that are either perhaps stable, increasing, or declining, but nonetheless, we have a big responsibility just in terms of the amount of habitat we have on the landscape. So, to narrow down to the species level, I'm going to use loggerhead shrike as an example of how trapping and banding fits into research that we are doing, why we're doing it, how we're doing it, and what we hope to get out of it. Shrikes are generally a declining family. I think there are only a couple shrike species in the entire family that are not in decline right now. Loggerhead shrike is declining pretty precipitously, and I'm going to go into that in a minute. But for those of you that are not familiar with shrikes, it's the songbird that hunts. I've seen some pretty remarkable things with loggerhead shrikes. I was in a cow pasture last year, and I was looking at an adult shrike that had impaled a hairy woodpecker on a branch. And next to this adult shrike was a pitifully squalling fledgling shrike, and was begging to have at that hairy woodpecker. And the adult ate the top half of the hairy woodpecker, and while this fledgling just begged and begged and begged. And finally, the adult kind of waddled to the side, and the fledgling polished that hairy woodpecker off straight down to the legs. And this is one example. It's a species with fascinating biology, both in terms of behavior, but also in terms of habitat presence. In terms of demographics, how they move on the landscape, all manner of things. And despite a decent amount of research on shrikes, it's one of those things where the more we take a look, the less we feel like we know. So I'm going to go through pretty quickly in terms of what the trends are for loggerhead shrike. This is the breeding bird survey for southeastern PIF regions in the United States. Basically, the gist is we've lost about 75% of our shrike population since BBS began, as far as BBS data tells us. One of the things that we are hoping to address, and I'll talk about this at the end, is breeding bird survey is likely very inadequate for assessing shrike populations, since shrikes don't behave like other songbirds. They're not singing a whole lot. You can't really detect them in the same ways, and so we take BBS data with a grain of salt, but nonetheless, they indicate robust and clear and sustained long-term declines for the species. If you look in terms of population responsibility for shrike, probably Texas has more shrikes in the southeast than any other state, and it just goes down from there. If you look at West Virginia and Maryland, I feel kind of sad that I don't even make it onto the chart, even though I know I do have shrikes. But if you look at abundance rate for shrikes, Texas is a very big state, so naturally it has a lot of shrikes. But if you were to go to Louisiana, for example, probably no other state has the densities of shrikes that coastal Louisiana has. Still, even today, after suffering long-term declines, generally, if you're in the southern Gulf Coast plain of Louisiana and you're driving around, you're seeing shrikes on a pretty regular basis. As you head east and northeast, that abundance declines pretty precipitously until you get to Virginia and West Virginia. If you go north from there, shrikes used to exist up into Vermont, and they still persist in Ontario. The population is propped up with a captive breeding program currently. If you expand this out to nationwide assessment of shrike abundance, you can see in yellow statistically significant long-term declines. There's some states that have no significant trend, but generally the picture is not good. If you shrink it down to short term, the last 10 years, at least up till 2012, you can see that the situation may be improving a little bit. Either that, or the curve of the decline might be leveling out simply because it's been going on for so long, based against the limits or whatever is going on to reduce the population. If you look at the southeast region, again, if you look at Texas, it's getting worse, but there's some good news possibly in Louisiana and Florida. So if we take a look at shrike populations at the very northeast frontier, their breeding range now in the United States, in Virginia and West Virginia, you can get a sense of what our population is. West Virginia is the proud owner of maybe 10 to 30 pairs of shrikes at this point. It's really hard to assess exactly what that number is, but I would suspect I know most of my shrikes by name. If you look at Virginia, the situation's slightly better, but again, that trend continues to decline, both in terms of breeding bird surveys and also Christmas bird counts. Something's going on. We have a problem. What are we going to do about it? On the bottom left is the breeding bird atlas map for loggerhead shrike in West Virginia. Each one of those squares, however, represents a single observation in most cases, or a single breeding pair. So a lot of people think they know shrike habitat. I think I know shrike habitat, but I think we have a lot to learn about what shrike habitat is. And so what I can do is talk about shrike habitat as it exists in the Northeast and as it exists in West Virginia. And this picture you're looking at is a shrike site that's been occupied continuously since the early 90s. It's a stable landscape. It's been under continuous grazing pressure for that whole time. But if you take a look at this pasture, it looks a whole lot different than a lot of other farms and pastures you see these days. One of those issues that really hits on grass and birds are clean farming practices. And if I drive around southeastern West Virginia looking for shrikes, it becomes quickly apparent after you start looking for the right sorts of things, just how scarce shrike habitat is on the landscape. Remarkably scarce, in fact. So if you look at it, it's an actively grazed pasture. Shrikes love short grass because it means they can see all the huge myriad of things that they would like to hunt and eat. Abundant hunting perches. They love to sit and wait and then sally out or fly to another perch. Generally, perches spaced about 60 feet is best. You have a lot of diversity on the ground. This seems to be a really key factor across the board with shrikes. It's not just that it's short grass, but if you look, there's bare rocks, there's mud wallows, there's fences, there's just a lot of structural diversity, even in something like a cow pasture. They're obviously nesting in places where hopefully predators can't get at the nests. Shrikes love to build their nests in hawthorns in this pasture. I wish I had the laser pointer, but there's a hawthorn with a multiflora rose growing straight up through it. It's almost impenetrable, and that's the types of places that the shrikes will nest. And one of the things that's been a concern about shrikes is the fact that they love to hunt by roadside. So there's this notion that shrikes die a lot from getting hit by cars. They'll just go down the road, get run over, or impact. And so the farther away from a roadside these sites are, the better it is. And so this site, for example, is well off the road, and they're not exposed to that type of risk. Also, shrike habitat is often ephemeral on the landscape. Farmers are always doing various different things to farmland, so you need this steady supply of savanna-type habitat that basically is maintained over time, but sometimes at some sites it's lost while other pastures are growing up because farmers just aren't brush hogging their shrubs or what have you. But the general trend, unfortunately, is that this has been declining. What you're looking at here is a shrike site where the farmer brush hogged out all the honey locusts, and we call it getting corned. Basically, it's a cornfield now, and very poor habitat for most any grassland bird. So our goal is to try to prevent this before it happens. And obviously, farmers have their own incentives, mostly financial, to do what they do. So there's nothing we can do that doesn't dovetail with their interests. And so a lot of our work is trying to find ways that we can work together, and I'll talk about that a little bit later too. So getting back to that notion of habitat being very limiting and very scarce, this is a very quick and dirty Google Earth image that I made a couple days ago, but it really exemplifies the lack of habitat connectivity for shrikes in West Virginia. Even though this is a grassland landscape, clean farming practices where basically you have a fence, you have grass, and then you have another fence, has really eliminated a lot of habitat for shrikes in general. So we have these various patches that have been occupied for long term, and some of these patches, the habitat has been consistent long term, but as these sites wink out with the trend of increasingly cleaned out farms, we're losing our shrikes, and that's part of the equation, but it's not all of the equation. So this is getting back to that earlier image, and this really, for me, highlights why it is that I'm working with a species that there are only 10 or 20 to 30 pairs in the state. If I'm taking a look at cerulean warbler, for example, where I've got 35% of the global population, obviously I have a huge incentive to work with cerulean warbler, and we are aggressively working on cerulean warbler management. But what I'm looking at is ways to manage for species that carry along other species with them. Okay, that list is really long on the State Wildlife Action Plan. There's no way that I can tackle each individual species on that list. So I'm looking for species that are easily approachable, are really interesting, but also bring along a lot of other species with them. And in some cases, nest within the habitat nests within other habitats where you have high diversity in small space. So if you look at this is true. I can go to this patch, and there's cerulean warblers singing on the hillside. There's 2 or 3 golden wing breeding territories in the back early successional habitat there. The shrikes in the savanna. The bobolinks are in the more clean pasture. There are other shrike sites where literally I've got not only shrike, but I've got breeding vesper, henslows, savanna, grasshopper sparrows, bobolinks, all co-occurring on the same site. And so when I look at sites like that, I can't help but think something really special is going on here. There's something going on the way that this land is managed that's really important for sustaining these species. And so and without a doubt, one of the things we've noticed is that categorically where shrikes occur in West Virginia, those sites also host really good abundances and diversity of grassland birds. And so this is kind of making me think, if we can approach loggerhead shrike as an interesting species to engage with landowners on, it might be that we can kind of push back the tide of clean farming a little bit and maintain some of this high quality grassland habitat. So when we kind of initiated work on shrikes, I hosted a conference call from all nearby states trying to just figure out what was going on with shrike in other states in terms of conservation work. And the answer was crickets, basically. No one was working with shrikes because the conventional wisdom is that shrikes just don't fit very well with other species. They're just an atypical bird with atypical habitat, et cetera, et cetera. And so since then, we've made a pretty good case that that's not the case. And we've reached out to folks in Ontario, Canada, who have an ongoing shrike program, and other states have since signed on, and we've formalized an official shrike working group that's similar to the Golden Wing Working Group and others, where there are multiple partners across multiple agencies. We have a draft conservation action plan, and we're working in a coordinated fashion to tackle the issue. And so we have various priorities, but if we were to distill them down, we want to identify the limiting factors, what's actually causing shrikes to decline. We want to determine the genetic identity of the species range-wide. We want to identify population demographics and what's going on with things like age structure and movements and things like that. And finally, we want to start modeling for shrike habitat in a way that helps us predict or target landscapes for conservation work. So in this picture, this is a high karst valley in Virginia. I've got a shrike in hand, but to my right is Sergio Harding, my counterpart in Virginia. Also next to Sergio is U.S. Forest Service staff. This is a Forest Service-owned site near Blacksburg, Virginia, and on the left is staff from Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute. We're all partners in this endeavor, and there are others that are actively involved as well. But we all have our various areas of expertise, and by working together, we hope to make a difference. So getting into the trapping and banding of shrikes and what we do and how we do it, basically look at it as an essential tool for answering research questions, particularly questions pertaining to the demographics question as well as the genetics and health. 33 shrikes is not a large number, but if you take a look at our overall shrike population, it's very possibly 20% of our total shrike population has now been banded. And the results are already informing conservation goals. On the upper left is a picture of me with two recently fledged juvenile shrikes. They were still molting in their first pre-basic molt. And I had traps, and juvenile shrikes are not very intelligent. I had 2 traps out, and there were 3 fledglings. They all landed on the same trap and started fighting each other to go in the trap. The winner went in the trap, and we caught that bird, and then one of the losers flew to the next trap and hopped right in that one. So I had 2 shrikes in the hand at once. But it's just fascinating, very interesting to work with these birds. One of the things that's the case with shrikes is they almost overwhelmingly occur on privately owned lands. And so private landowner engagement is critical. It's always nice when species occur on public lands and you have access questions answered, you have permits issued, and you can basically feel free to work in all kinds of interesting ways. That's not the case on private lands. You have to work with the landowner, you have to engage with the landowner. This is on a private farm down in Pulaski County, Virginia, and on the right are the landowners and their family. And one of the things we always try to do after we secure permission to go and trap, which we almost always get, since landowners and farmers generally like wildlife. They generally like the notion that their farms host wildlife. And so if it looks like there's something interesting on their farms, they will actively want to help you out. But when you actually get them in the field and they actually see that bird in the hand, it is game over. You know, they are going to help you almost categorically. They will help you however much you want in the future. So we're banding a shrike here, and they got to see the bird up close, and it was a really meaningful thing for them. So specifically our objectives, we're hoping to quantify site occupancy across the annual cycle. We knew we have shrikes, but you can't really tell different shrikes apart unless they're banded. And before they were banded, we didn't know whether it was the same shrikes on the same sites across the annual cycle, or whether shrikes changed over by the seasons, or whether there's local dispersal or what. So we didn't have those questions answered. We want to get a sense of age structure, which in turn gives us a sense, obviously, of what a trend might be, how many young are being produced, etc. We want to refine the genetic atlas. I'm going to show you that later in the presentation, but there's some really interesting things we found about that. We're doing stable isotope work to try to identify connectivity between breeding and wintering populations. And obviously we're doing morphometrics and assessing fitness and disease, contaminant loads, things like that. So in terms of trap design, I'll hold up a shrike trap for those of you guys who haven't seen it. It's a modified potter trap with 2 gates. There's a mouse bait in the center. It works remarkably well, and it's remarkably safe. To my knowledge, I can't think off the top of my head of any shrike injuries using this trap design, which is of utmost importance to us. And it just, more importantly, it works remarkably well. There's an art to trap placement and identifying where to place the trap, how to entice the shrikes and things like that, but the trap itself works. If you look at where you might want to place a trap, in the upper right is the shrike up there. Shrikes have remarkably good vision for a songbird. They can see a lot farther than you think they can, upwards of oh, thank you. Thank you. There we go. So there's the shrike, there's the trap right there. Shrikes can see a good long distance, up to 60 or 70 feet in some cases, and so they'll get on that trap if they're hungry. We'll field up to 4 traps, but the number of traps depends obviously on the number of people we have in the field. All traps have to be watched at all times for obvious reasons. Shrikes are very skittish in the hand. They're very frantic in the hand. When they're in the trap, they can really injure themselves if you're not really quickly getting there to get them out. So leaving a shrike in a trap is a really, really bad idea. Once we've got the shrike, obviously we place the shrike in a holding bag. We take it to our banding kits, we pull them out, and then we do something that folks don't necessarily do with songbirds. We stuff them in a toilet paper tube, which basically calms the bird down and also prevents you from getting a shrike bite, which is a wonderful experience. In other words, you see those air holes on the tube. Shrikes will stick their bill out there. I'm holding a tube, and I'll just be talking, and all of a sudden, he's got me by the hand because I wasn't watching. So we get them in tubes, and that really eases the process. We've got standard banding sheets that most of you guys have seen some iteration or another, but it just quantifies all the different data that we're collecting, from old limits to morphometrics to all kinds of other things. In terms of bands that we use with shrikes, aluminum bands are not useful for shrikes. They can yank them off, they can crush them on their legs. They have a remarkable amount of bite force, and so we use stainless steel bands. Generally, they take a 1D size band, which is a European sized band, sometimes 1As or 2s. We also use double wrapped Darvik plastic bands for the color banding. We've only had one instance where a shrike has pulled those off, and it was, by as far as I can tell, the largest shrike banded ever in the eastern United States. And we banded him, and I came back, and he only had a steel band on his leg. It was a monster shrike, so he must have pulled those bands off. We have on the right leg, we've got a band, a color band that denotes year. Then we've got the USGS band. On the left band, we do a unique color combo that identifies the individual. This is remarkably helpful because all of a sudden we're able to identify what shrikes are on site across the year, when they leave, when they arrive. We also are happy to see a steady supply of unbanded shrikes showing up on our sites. So we know that we've got dispersal or infeed from somewhere, even if we can't answer that question. We also have a well-developed now shrike banding manual, and we're hoping to expand the shrike banding program into other states. It's already in the works in South Carolina, and we're expanding into North Carolina, Georgia, Louisiana, and other places as time goes on. So on the left is a female shrike. You see how the dark extends in kind of a V pattern on the feather, whereas in males it's flat across, and that's how you sex shrikes. Otherwise, you're using genetics to do it. So other morphometrics, obviously we're doing tail measurements. We weigh the shrike in the toilet paper tube using a Sola scale and a rubber band behind the leg. It works really well and enables us to quickly weigh the bird. Then we unclip it, and that's usually the last thing we do. We'll release the bird after that. Fat scores. We're doing bill measurements. There's me getting bit by a shrike. As you know, you just have to grin and bear it, right? We're also taking feather samples, and the feather samples are supporting our genetic analysis, taking a look at identifying subspecies, genetically distinct populations. We're taking a look at stable isotopes in terms of movements and connectivity between breeding and wintering grounds, so far it's been really instrumental in answering a really neat question that I'm going to tell you about in a little bit. We're also doing oral swabs and blood draws. Oral swabs obviously are helping us assess exposure to West Nile virus. There's a pretty decent amount of evidence that shrikes took a pretty big hit from West Nile, and so this is enabling us to take a look at viral loads and seeing whether the virus is still present in the population and to what extent it's present in the population. Also, normal healthy bacterial flora for the species has not been characterized at all, and so we're being supported by veterinary staff from Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute, and their vets are going into the field with us and doing the swabbing. We take blood samples from the jugular rather than the brachial artery. It makes it a bit of a faster process with less bruising. Our vets are extremely good at this. I'm not sure I would want to attempt it myself, but it answers lots of questions from genetics to parasites to hematology, all kinds of things. And obviously, after we ban the shrike, we release it and we watch it for a good while to make sure that everything's okay. As you can see, we've got the unique color band combo, so we'll be able to ID that shrike fur, as long as we're able to see it. So some of the results of the project are really super interesting. Up here is a genetic atlas map that was completed by Dr. Amy Shabbat in Ontario, Canada, as part of her PhD work. And basically, it was taking a look at intrinsic markers for genetics for distinct population subspecies and comparing it against what the conventional wisdom was for shrike subspecies. And one of the interesting things she found out, and all the black dots here are areas that were sampled, lots up here in Canada, along the coastal plain here and other places up here in Canada, is that the population up in Ontario was genetically distinct from all of the other shrike populations that she sampled. And this is in the process of getting written up, but basically there's a strong evidence we feel that there's a distinct subspecies of shrike centered around Ontario and the Northeast that likely extended into New England and south into Pennsylvania. So but if you notice, Virginia and West Virginia were not sampled in this study. And so what we're doing in this banding program is greatly increasing the sample size in terms of taking a look at the genetics of the species across its range. And lo and behold, of 44 samples from Virginia and West Virginia, including museum specimens, 42 of those match up with the Ontario shrike population. And the species, we're going to likely call it alvarensis for the Alvar province up in Ontario, but it looks like this subspecies still extends down into the southern Virginia. And so this is something that can really inform conservation in the future, particularly given how grim the situation is for this subspecies. The Ontario population, they had 11 breeding pairs in Ontario this past breeding season. If I only, in any given season, have 10 and Virginia has maybe 50 to 100, it's a pretty small population. So those are immediate results that I'm really fascinated by. So we're also taking a look at shrike movements. Again, like I said, the shrike's not banned in the site's occupied. We don't know what's happening across the annual cycle. And lo and behold, when we first started, we trapped 10 shrikes in March 2014 in West Virginia. And I went back to check on those birds a month later, in late April, and not a single banded bird was on any of those sites. They were replaced with unbanded birds instead. So there's something, it seems like the common thread is the habitat, are the shrike sites, that necessarily the birds either move around on a local level, or we've got a migratory shrike population where wintering birds are replaced by breeding birds and vice versa across the cycle. Just one of the interesting things that we're finding out. Another thing that this is feeding into, as we identify shrike sites and trap and ban, is we're working on building a habitat suitability model across the southeastern portion of the species range that's going to then extend into the rest of the United States. It's bringing in a lot of different variables. It's initially based on eBird checklists filtered to presence and absence. In other words, it brought in eBird checklists where their shrikes were not detected as well. Number of individuals. The protocol is a stationary protocol, so it filtered out a lot of eBird results where there's a lot of slop in terms of location data and stuff like that. So we were only using data where we had a known point for the occurrence. And then the model is being developed at Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute. We're feeding in points where we're finding shrikes, we're confirming shrikes on the landscape, and we're validating the model using that. So it's just another example of how it's helping out. So in the future, obviously this is something we want to expand, and any of you guys, particularly those of you that are really actively into banding, have an interest in expanding into shrikes in your particular location. If you co-occur with shrikes on the landscape, we have a great eagerness to engage with you in terms of shrike trapping and banding. We're reliant on volunteers and agencies and staff to get this done. But we want to complete the modeling project. One of the things that we have really high priority right now is to take a look at detection probabilities with the breeding bird survey and really test how efficient it is at detecting shrikes. And if it's not efficient, we want to identify survey methodology that will detect shrikes more reliably and enable us to better assess populations and densities on the landscape. Finally, we're working on finalizing the species conservation action plan that's really going to guide our work, at least for the next 5 years or so. And so that's all I've got. I hope you enjoyed it. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to entertain them. And again, like I said, eager to engage with any banders interested in working with